listener, today we start our third part of this book, so please listen carefully. Thanks. Chapter 13, The Pirate Crew Set Sail. Tom's mind was made up. Now he was gloomy and desperate. He was a forsaken, friendless boy. He said nobody loved him when they found out what they had driven him to. Perhaps they would be sorry he had tried to do right and get along, but they would not let him since nothing would do them. But to get rid of him, let it be so, and let them blame him for the consequences. Why shouldn't they? What right had the friendless to complain? Yes, they had forced him to it. At last he would lead a life of crime. There was no choice. By this time he was far down Meadow Lane, and the bell for school to take up tingled faintly upon his ear. He sobbed now to think he should never hear that old familiar sound any more. It was very hard, but it was forced on him. Since he was driven out into the cold world, he must submit, but he forgave them. Then the sobs came thick and fast. Just at this point he met his soul's sworn comrade, Joe Harper, hard-eyed, and with evidently a great and dismal purpose in his heart. Plainly here were two souls with but a single thought. Tom, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, began to blubber out something about a resolution to escape from hard usage and lack of sympathy at home by roaming abroad into the great world, never to return, and ended by hoping that Joe would not forget him. But it transpired that this was a request which Joe had just been going to make of Tom, and had come to hunt him up for that purpose. His mother had whipped him for drinking some cream which he had never tasted and knew nothing about. It was plain that she was tired of him and wished him to go. If she felt that way, there was nothing for him to do but succumb. He hoped she would be happy and never regret having driven her poor boy out into the unfeeling world to suffer and die. As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a new compact to stand by each other and be brothers and never separate till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay their plans. Joe was for being a hermit and living on crusts in a remote cave and dying sometime of cold and want and grief. But after listening to Tom, he conceded that there were some conspicuous advantages about a life of crime. And so he consented to be a pirate 3 miles below St. Petersburg, at a point where the Mississippi River was a trifle over a mile wide. There was a long narrow wooded island with a shallow bar at the head of it, and this offered well as a rendezvous. It was not inhabited. It lay far over towards the further shore, abreast a dense and almost wholly unpeopled forest. So Jackson's Island was chosen. Who were to be the subjects of their paras was a matter that did not occur to them. Then they hunted up Huckleberry Finn, and he joined them promptly. For all careers were one to him. He was indifferent. They presently separated to meet at a lonely spot on the riverbank 2 miles above the village at the favorite hour, which was midnight. There was a small log raft there, which they meant to capture. Each would bring hooks and lines and such provision as he could steal in the most dark and mysterious way. As became outlaws, and before the afternoon was done, they had all managed to enjoy the sweet glory of spreading the fact that pretty soon the town would hear something. All who got this vague hint were cautioned to be mum and wait. About midnight Tom arrived with a boiled ham and a few trifles, and stopped in a dense undergrowth on a small bluff overlooking the meeting place. It was starlight and very still. The mighty river lay like an ocean at rest. Tom listened a moment, but no sound disturbed the quiet. Then he gave a low distinct whistle. It was answered from under the bluff. Tom whistled twice more. These signals were answered in the same way. Then a guarded voice said, "Who goes there?" "Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main." "Name your names." "Huck Finn, the Red-Handed, and Joe Harper, the Terror of the Seas." Tom had furnished these titles from his favorite literature. "'Tis well, give the countersign." 2 hoarse whispers, deliver the same awful word simultaneously to the brooding night blood. Then Tom tumbled his ham over the bluff and let himself down after it, tearing both skin and clothes to some extent in the effort. There was an easy, comfortable path along the shore, under the bluff, but it lacked the advantages of difficulty and danger. So valued by a pirate, the terror of the seas had brought a side of bacon and had about worn himself out with getting it there. Finn, the red-handed, had stolen a skillet and a quantity of half-cured leaf tobacco and had also brought a few corn cobs to make pipes with. But none of the pirates smoked or chewed but himself. The Black Avenger of the Spanish Main said it would never do to start without some fire. That was a wise thought. Matches were hardly known there in that day. They saw a fire smouldering upon a great raft 100 yards above, and they went stealthily thither and helped themselves to a chunk. They made an imposing adventure of it, saying hissed every now and then and suddenly halting with finger on lip, moving with hands on imaginary dagger hilts and giving orders in dismal whispers that if the foe stirred to let him have it to the hilt, because dead men tell no tales. They knew well enough that the RAS men were all down at the village laying in stores or having a spree, but still that was no excuse for their conducting this thing in an unical way. They shoved off presently, Tom in command, Huck at the after oar and Joe at the forward. Tom stood amidships and gloomy-browed and with folded arms, and gave his orders in the low stern whisper, "Love and bring her to the wind." "Aye, sir. Steady, steady, steady." "It is, sir." "Let her go off a point." "Point." "It is, sir." As the boys steadily and monotonously drove the raft toward midstream, it was no doubt understood that these orders were given only for style and were not intended to mean anything in particular. "What sail she carrying? Courses, topsails and flying gibs, sir." "Send the riles up." "Lay out aloft." "There half a dozen of you." 4. "Top menstrual lively." "Now I ice her, shake out that main to gallant sheets and braces." "Now my hearties." "Aye, sir." "Hela Lee hired a port stand to meet her when she comes port." "Port now, man with a will." "Steady, steady to, sir." The raft drew beyond the middle of the river. The boys pointed her head right and then lay on their oars. The river was not high, so there was not more than a 2 or 3 mile current. Hardly a word was said during the next 3/4 of an hour. Now the raft was passing before the distant town. 2 or 3 glimmering lights showed where it lay peacefully sleeping beyond the vague vast sweep of a star-jammed water, unconscious of the tremendous event that was happening. The Black Avenger stood still with folded arms, looking his last upon the scene of his former joys and his later sufferings, and wishing she could see him now abroad on the wild sea, facing peril and death with dauntless heart, going to his doom with a grim smile on his lips. It was but a small strain on his imagination to remove Jackson's Island beyond eye-shot of the village. And so he looked his last with a broken and satisfied heart. The other pirates were looking their last too, and they all looked so long that they came near letting the current drift them out of the range of the island. But they discovered the danger in time and made shift to avert it. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the raft grounded on the bar 200 yards above the head of the island, and they waded back and forth until they had landed their freight. Part of the little raft's belongings consisted of an old sail, and this they spread over a nook in the bushes for a tent to shelter their provisions, but they themselves would sleep in the open air in good weather as became outlaws. They built a fire against the side of a great log, 20 or 30 steps within the somber depths of the forest, and then cooked some bacon in the frying pan for supper and used up half of the corn-pone stock they had brought. It seemed glorious sport to be feasting in that wild freeway in the virgin forest of an unexplored and uninhabited island far from the haunts of men. And they said they never would return to civilization. The climbing fire lit up their faces and threw its ruddy glare upon the pillared tree trunks of their forest temple and upon the varnished foliage and fasting vines. When the last crisp slice of bacon was gone and the last allowance of corn-pone devoured, the boys stretched themselves out in the grass filled with contentment. They could have found a cooler place, but they would not deny themselves such a romantic feature as the roasting campfire. Ain't it gay, said Joe. It's nuts, said Tom. What would the boys say if they could see us? Say, well, they just die to be here. Hey I reckon so, said Huckleberry. Anyways, I'm suited. I don't want nothing better than this. I don't ever get enough to eat generally, and here they can't come and pick at a fella and bully rag him. So it's just the life for me. He said, Tom, you don't have to get up mornings and you don't have to go to school and wash and all that. Blame foolishness. You see, a pirate don't have to do anything, Joe, when he's ashore, but a hermit. He has to be a praying considerable. And then he don't have any fun anyway all by himself that way. Oh yes, that's so, said Joe. But I hadn't thought much about it. I had a good deal, rather be a pirate now that I've tried it. You see, he said, Tom, people don't go much on hermits nowadays like they used to in the old times, but a pirate's always respected in a hermit's. Got to sleep on the hardest place he can find and put sackcloth and ashes on his head and stand out in the rain. And what does he put an ashes on his head for, inquired Huck. I don't know, but they've got to do it. Hermits always do. You'd have to do that if he was a hermit. Darned if I would, said Huck. Well, what would you do? I don't know, but I wouldn't do that. But Huck, you'd have to. How'd you get around it? Why, I just wouldn't stand it. I'd run away. Run away? Well, you would be a nice old slouch of a hermit. You'd be a disgrace. The red-handed made no response, being better employed. He had finished gouging out a cob and now he fitted a weed stem to it, loaded it with tobacco and was pressing a coal to the charge and blowing a cloud of fragrant smoke. He was in the full bloom of luxurious contentment. The other pirates envied him this majestic vice and secretly resolved to acquire it shortly. Presently, Huck said, "What does pirates have to do?" Tom said, "Oh, they have just a bully time. Take ships and burn them and get the money and bury it in awful places in their island where there's ghosts and things to watch it, and kill everybody in the ships. Make 'em walk a plank and they carry the women to the island," said Joe. "They don't kill the women." "No," is sent to Tom. "They don't kill the women. They're too noble. And the women's always beautiful too. And don't they wear the bullies' clothes?" "Oh no. All gold and silver and diamonds," said Joe with enthusiasm, who said, "Chuck, why the pirates." Huck scanned his own clothing forlornly. "And I reckon I ain't dressed fitting for a pirate," said he with a regretful pathos in his voice, "but I ain't got none but these." But the other boys told him the fine clothes would come fast enough after they should have begun their adventures. They made him understand that his poor rags would do to begin with, though it was customary for wealthy pirates to start with a proper wardrobe. Gradually their talk died out and drowsiness began to steal upon the eyelids of the little waves. The pipe dropped from the fingers of the red-handed and he slept the sleep of the conscience-free and the weary. The terror of the seas and the black avenger of the Spanish Main had more difficulty in getting to sleep. They said their prayers inwardly and lying down, since there was nobody there with authority to make them kneel and recite aloud in truth. They had a mind not to say them at all, but they were afraid to proceed to such lengths at that, lest they might call down a sudden and special thunderbolt from heaven. Then at once they reached and hovered upon the imminent verge of sleep, but an intruder came now that would not down. It was conscience. They began to feel a vague fear that they had been doing wrong to run away. And next they thought of the stolen meat, and then the real torture came. They tried to argue it away by reminding conscience that they had purloined sweetmeats and apple scores at times, but conscience was not to be appeased by such thin plausibility. It seemed to them that there was no getting around a stubborn fact that taking sweetmeats was only hooking, while taking bacon and hams and such valuables was plain simple stealing, and there was a command against that and the Bible. So they inwardly resolved that so long as they remained in the business, their parishes should not again be sullied with the crime of stealing. Then conscience granted a truce, and these curiously inconsistent pirates fell peacefully to sleep. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, Happy Camp of the Freebooters. When Tom awoke in the morning, he wondered where he was. He sat up and rubbed his eyes and looked around. Then he comprehended. It was the cool gray dawn, and there was a delicious sense of repose and peace in the deep pervading calm and silence of the woods. Not a leaf stirred, not a sound oft prodded upon great nature's meditation. Beaded dewdrops stood upon the leaves and grasses. A white layer of ashes covered the fire, and a thin blue breath of smoke rose straight into the air. Joe and Huck still slept now far away in the woods. A bird called, another answered. Presently, the hammering of a woodpecker was heard gradually, the cool dim gray of the morning whitened, and as gradually sounds multiplied and life manifested itself, the marvel of nature shaking off sleep and going to work unfolded itself to the musing boy. A little green worm came crawling over a dewy leaf, lifting 2/3 of his body into the air from time to time and sniffing around, then proceeding again, for he was measuring. Tom said, and when the worm approached him of its own accord, he sat as still as a stone, with his hopes rising and falling by turns as the creature still came toward him or seemed inclined to go elsewhere. And when at last, it considered a painful moment with its curved body in the air, and then came decisively down upon Tom's leg and began journeying over him, his whole heart was glad, for that meant that he was going to have a new suit of clothes without the shadow of a doubt, a gaudy tikal uniform. Now a procession of ants appeared from nowhere in particular and went about their labors. One struggled manfully by with a dead spider 5 times as big as itself in its arms and lugged it straight up a tree trunk. A brown spotted ladybug climbed the dizzy height of a grass blade, and Tom bent down close to it and said, "Ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire. Your children's alone." And she took wing and went off to see about it, which did not surprise the boy. For he knew of old that this insect was credulous about conflagrations, and he had practiced upon its simplicity more than once. A tumble-bug came next, heaving sterilely at its ball, and Tom touched the creature to see it shut its legs against its body and pretend to dead. The birds were fairly rioting by this time. A catbird, the northern mocker, lit in a tree over Tom's head and trilled out her imitations of her neighbors in a rapture of enjoyment. Then a shrill jay swept down a flash of blue flame and stopped on a twig almost within the boy's reach, cocked his head to one side and eyed the strangers with a consuming curiosity. A gray squirrel and a big fellow of the fox kind came scurrying along, sitting up at intervals to inspect and chatter of the boys, for the wild things had probably never seen a human being before and scarcely knew whether to be afraid or not. All nature was wide awake and stirring. Now long lances of sunlight pierced down through the dense foliage far and near, and a few butterflies came fluttering upon the scene. Tom stirred up the other pirates, and they all clattered away with a shout, and in a minute or two were stripped and chasing after and tumbling over each other in the shallow limpid water of the white sandbar. They felt no longing for the little village sleeping in the distance beyond the majestic waste of water. A vagrant current or a slight rise in the river had carried off their raft, but this only gratified them, since its going with something like burning the bridge between them and civilization. They came back to camp wonderfully refreshed, glad-hearted and ravenous, and they soon had the campfire blazing up again. Huck found a spring of clear cold water close by, and the boys made cups of broad oak or hickory leaves and felt that water sweetened with such a wildwood charm as that would be a good enough substitute for coffee. While Joe was slicing bacon for breakfast, Tom and Huck asked him to hold on a minute. They stepped to a promising nook in the riverbank and threw in their lines almost immediately. They had reward. Joe had not had time to get impatient before they were back again with some handsome bass, a couple of sun perch and a small catfish provisions. Enough for quite a family. They fry the fish with the bacon and were astonished, for no fish had ever seemed so delicious. Before they did not know that the quicker a fresh water fish is on the fire after it is caught, the better he is, and they reflected little upon what a sauce, open air, sleeping, open air, exercise, bathing, and a large ingredient of hunger makes too. They lay around in the shade after breakfast while Huck had a smoke and then went off through the woods on an exploring expedition. They tramped along over decaying logs through tangled underbrush. Among solemn monarchs of the forest hung from their crowns to the ground with a drooping regalia of grapevines. Now and then they came upon snug nooks carpeted with grass and jeweled with flowers. They found plenty of things to be delighted with, but nothing to be astonished at. They discovered that the island was about 3 miles long and a quarter of a mile wide, and that the shore it lay closest to was only separated from it by a narrow channel, hardly 200 yards wide. They took a swim about every hour, so it was close upon the middle of the afternoon when they got back to the camp. They were too hungry to stop to fish, but they fared sumptuously upon cold ham and then threw themselves down in the shade to talk, but the talk soon began to drag and then died. The stillness, the solemnity that brooded in the woods and the sense of loneliness began to tell upon the spirits of the boys. They fell to thinking, a sort of undefined longing crept upon them. This took dim shape. Presently it was budding homesickness. Even Finn, the red-handed, was dreaming of his doorsteps and empty hogsheads, but they were all ashamed of their weakness and none was brave enough to speak his thought. For some time now, the boys had been dully conscious of a particular sound in the distance, just as one sometimes is of the ticking of a clock, which he takes no distinct note of. But now this mysterious sound became more pronounced and forced a recognition. The boys started, glanced at each other, and then each assumed a listening attitude. There was a long silence, profound and unbroken, and then a deep soon boom came floating down out of the distance. "What is it?" exclaimed Joe under his breath. "I wonder," said Tom, and a whisper, "'Tain't thunder," said Barry in an odd tone, because thunder. Hark, said Tom, "listen, don't talk." They waited a time that seemed an age, and then the same muffled boom troubled the solemn hush. "Let's go and see." They sprang to their feet and hurried to the shore toward the town. They parted the bushes on the bank and peered out over the water. The little steam ferry boat was about a mile below the village, drifting with the current. Her broad deck seemed crowded with people. There was a great many skiffs rowing about or floating with the stream in the neighborhood of the ferry boat, but the boys could not determine what the men and them were doing. Presently, a great jet of white smoke burst from the ferry boat side, and as it expanded and rose in a lazy cloud, that same dull throb of sound was borne to the listeners again. "I know now," exclaimed Tom, "somebody's drowned." "That's it," said Huck. "They'd done that last summer when Bill Turnt got drowned. They shoot a cannon over the water and that makes him come up to the top. Yes, and they take loaves of bread and put quicksilver in them and set 'em afloat, and wherever there's anybody that's drowned, they'll float right there and stop." "Yes, I've heard about that," said Joe. "I wonder what makes the bread do that." "Oh, it ain't the bread so much," said Tom. "I reckon it's mostly what they say over it before they start it out, but they don't say anything over it," said Huck. "I've seen them and they don't." "Well, that's funny," said Tom, "but maybe they say it to themselves." "Of course they do." Anybody might know that the other boys agree that there was reason in what Tom said, because an ignorant lump of bread, instruct by an incantation, could not be expected to act very intelligently when sent upon an errand of such gravity by Jing. "I wish I was over there now," said Joe. "I do too," said Huck. "I give heaps to know who it is." The boys still listened and watched. Presently, a revealing thought flashed through Tom's mind and he exclaimed, "Boys, I know who's drowned. It's us." They felt like heroes in an instant. Here was a gorgeous triumph. They were missed. They were mourned. Hearts were breaking on their account. Tears were being shed. Accusing memories of unkindness to these poor lost lads were rising up and unveiling. Regrets and remorse were being indulged, and best of all, the departed were the talk of the whole town and the envy of all the boys. As far as this dazzling notoriety was concerned, this was fine. It was worthwhile to be a pirate after all. As twilight drew on, the ferry boat went back to her accustomed business and the skits disappeared. The pirates returned to camp. They were jubilant with vanity over their new grandeur and the illustrious trouble they were making. They caught fish, cooked supper, and ate it, and then fell to guessing at what the village was thinking and saying about them. And the pictures they drew of the public distress on their account were gratifying to look upon from their point of view. But when the shadows of night closed them in, they gradually ceased to talk and sat gazing into the fire with their minds evidently wandering elsewhere. The excitement was gone now, and Tom and Joe could not keep back. Thoughts of certain persons at home who were not enjoying this fine frolic as much as they were misgivings came. They grew troubled and unhappy. Sawyer or two escaped unawares by, and by Joe timidly ventured upon a roundabout feeler as to how the others might look upon a return to civilization. Not right now, but Tom withered him with derision. Huck, being uncommitted, as yet joined in with Tom, and the waver quickly explained and was glad to get out of the scrape with his little taint of chicken-hearted homesickness, clinging to his garments as he could. Mutiny was effectually laid to rest for the moment. As the night deepened, Huck began to nod and presently to snore. Joe followed next. Tom lay upon his elbow motionless for some time, watching the two intently. At last, he got up cautiously on his knees and went searching among the grass and the flickering reflections flung by the campfire. He picked up and inspected several large semi-cylinders of the thin white bark of a sycamore, and finally chose two, which seemed to suit him. Then he knelt by the fire and painfully wrote something upon each of these with his red keel. One rolled up and put in his jacket pocket, and the other he put in Joe's hat and removed it to a little distance from the owner, and he also put into the hat certain schoolboy treasures of almost inestimable value, among them, a lump of chalk, an India rubber ball, 3 fish hooks, and one of that kind of marbles known as the sure enough crystal. Then he tiptoed his way cautiously among the trees till he felt that he was out of hearing, and straightway broke into a keen run in the direction of the sandbar. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15, Tom's stealthy visit home. A few minutes later, Tom was in the shoal water of the bar wading toward the Illinois shore before the depth reached his middle. He was halfway over. The current would permit no more wading now, so he struck out confidently to swim the remaining 100 yards. He swam quartering upstream, but still was swept downward rather faster than he had expected. However, he reached the shore finally and drifted along till he found a low place and drew himself out. He put his hand on his jacket pocket, found his piece of bark safe, and then struck through the woods following the shore with streaming garments. Shortly before 10 o'clock, he came out into an open place opposite the village and saw the ferry boat lying in the shadow of the trees and the high bank. Everything was quiet under the blinking stars. He crept down the bank watching with all his eyes, slipped into the water, swam 3 or 4 strokes, and climbed into the skiff that did yawl duty at the boat's stern. He laid himself down under the THPs and waited, panting. Presently the cracked bell tapped and the voice gave the order to cast off. A minute or two later, the skiff's head was standing high up against the boat's swell and the voyage was begun. Tom felt happy in his success, for he knew it was the boat's last trip for the night. At the end of a long 12 or 15 minutes, the wheel stopped and Tom slipped overboard and swam ashore in the dusk, landing 50 yards downstream out of danger of possible stragglers. He flew along unfrequently alleys and shortly found himself at his aunt's back fence. He climbed over, approached the L and looked in at the sitting room window, for a light was burning. There sat Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and Joe Harper's mother grouped together talking. They were by the bed and the bed was between them and the door. Tom went to the door and began to softly lift the latch. Then he pressed gently and the door yielded a crack. He continued pushing cautiously and quaking. Every time it creaked till he judged he might squeeze through on his knees, so he put his head through and began. "Lee, what makes the candles blow so?" said Aunt Polly. Tom hurried up. "Why, that door is open." "I believe." "Why, of course it is. No end of strange things. Now go along and shut it." Sid. Tom disappeared under the bed just in time. He lay and breathed himself for a while, then crept to where he could almost touch his aunt's foot. "But as I was saying," said Aunt Polly, "he weren't bad, so to say, only mischievous, only just giddy and horror scare him. You weren't any more responsible than a colt. He never meant any harm and he was the best-hearted boy that ever was," and she began to cry. "It was just so with my Joe, always full of his devilment and up to every kind of mischief, but he was just as unselfish and kind as he could be, and laws blessed me to think I went and whipped him for taking that cream. Never once recollecting that I throwed it out myself because it was sour and I never to see him again in this world. Never, never, never." Poor abused boy, and Mrs. Harper sobbed as if her heart would break. "I hope Tom's better off where he is," said Sid, "but if he'd been better in some ways, Sid." Tom felt the glare of the old lady's eye, though he could not see it. "Not a word against my Tom. Now that he's gone, God will take care of him. Never you trouble yourself, sir." "Oh, Mrs. Harper. I don't know how to give him up. I don't know how to give him up. He was such a comfort to me. Although he tormented my old heart out of me. Most the Lord giveth and the Lord has taken away. Bless it be the name of the Lord, but it's so hard. Oh, it's so hard. Only last Saturday my job busted a firecracker right under my nose and I knocked him sprawling. Little did I know then how soon. Oh, if it was to do over again, I'd hug him and bless him for it. Yes, yes, yes. I know just how you feel, Mrs. Harper. I know just exactly how you feel. No longer ago than yesterday, noon, my Tom took and filled the cat full of painkiller and I did think the creature would tear the house down, and God forgive me, I cracked Tom's head with my thimble. Poor boy. Poor dead boy. But he's out of all his troubles now, and the last words I ever heard him say was to reproach, but this memory was too much for the old lady and she broke entirely down. Tom was snuffling now himself and more in pity of himself than anybody else. He could hear Mary crying and putting in a kindly word for him. From time to time he began to have a knower opinion of himself than ever before. Still, he was sufficiently touched by his aunt's grief to long to rush out from under the bed and overwhelm her with joy, and the theatrical gorgeousness of the thing appealed strongly to his nature too, but he resisted and lay still. He went on listening and gathered by odds and ends that it was conjectured at first that the boys had drowned while taking a swim. Then the small raft had been missed. Next certain boys said the missing lads had promised that the village should hear something soon. The wise heads had put this and that together and decided that the lads had gone off on that raft and would turn up at the next town below presently, but toward noon, the raft had been found lodged against the Missouri shore, some 5 or 6 miles below the village, and then hope perished. They must be drowned, else hunger would have driven them home by nightfall if not sooner. It was believed that the search for the bodies had been a fruitless effort, merely because the drowning must have occurred in mid-channel, since the boys, being good swimmers, would otherwise have escaped to shore. This was Wednesday night. If the bodies continued missing until Sunday, all hope would be given over and the funerals would be preached. On that morning, Tom shuddered. Mrs. Harper gave a sobbing good night and turned to go. Then with a mutual impulse, the two bereaved women flung themselves into each other's arms and had a good consoling cry and then parted, and Polly was tendered far beyond her wont in her good night to Sid and Mary. Sid snuffled a bit, and Mary went off crying with all her heart. Aunt Polly knelt down and prayed for Tom. So touchingly, so appealingly, and with such measureless love in her words and her old trembling voice that he was weltering in tears again long before she was through. He had to keep still long after she went to bed, for she kept making broken-hearted ejaculations from time to time, tossing unrestful and turning over. But last she was still only moaning a little in her sleep. Now the boy stole out, rose gradually from the bedside, shaded the candle light with his hand and stood regarding her. His heart was full of pity for her. He took out his sycamore scroll and placed it by the candle, but something occurred to him and he lingered, considering, his face lighted with a happy solution of his thought. He put the bark haste in his pocket. Then he bent over and kissed the faded lips and straightway made his stealthy exit, latching the door behind him. He threaded his way back to the ferry landing, found nobody at large there and walked boldly on board the boat, for he knew she was talentless, except that there was a watchman who always turned in and slept like a graven image. He untied the skiff at the stern, slipped into it and was soon rowing cautiously upstream. When he had pulled a mile above the village, he started quartering across and bent himself stoutly to his work. He hit the landing on the other side neatly, for this was a familiar bit of work for him. He was moved to capture the skiff, arguing that it might be considered a ship and therefore a legitimate prey for a pirate. But he knew a thorough search would be made for it and that might end in revelations. So he stepped ashore and entered the wood. He sat down and took a long rest, torturing himself meantime to keep awake, and then started wear down the home stretch. The night was far spent. It was broad daylight before he found himself fairly abreast the island bar. He rested again until the sun was well up and gilding the great river with its splendor. And then he plunged into the stream. A little later he paused, dripping upon the threshold of the camp, and heard Joe say, "No, Tom's true blue Huck. He'll come back. He won't desert. He knows that would be a disgrace to a pirate. And Tom's too proud for that sort of thing. He's up to something or other. I wonder what. Well, the things is ours anyway. Ain't they pretty near? But not yet. Huck, the writing says they are. If he ain't back here to breakfast, which he is," exclaimed Tom with fine dramatic effect, stepping grandly into camp. A sumptuous breakfast of bacon and fish was shortly provided, and as the boys set to work upon it, Tom recounted and adorned his adventures. They were a vain and boastful company of heroes when the tale was done. Then Tom hid himself away in a shady nook to sleep till noon, and the other pirates got ready to fish and explore. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16, First Pipes, I've Lost My Knife. After dinner, all the gang turned out to hunt for turtle eggs on the bar. They went about poking sticks into the sand, and when they found a soft place, they went down on their knees and dug with their hands. Sometimes they would take 50 or 60 eggs out of one hole. They were perfectly round white things, a trifle smaller than an English walnut. They had a famous fried egg feast that night and another on Friday morning after breakfast. They went whooping and prancing out on the bar and chased each other round and round, shedding clothes as they went until they were naked. And then continued the frolic far away, up the shoal water of the bar against the stiff current, which latter tripped their legs from unto them from time to time and greatly increased the fun. And now and then they stooped in a group and splashed water in each other's faces with their palms, gradually approaching each other with averted faces to avoid the strangling sprays, and finally gripping and struggling till the best man ducked his neighbor. And then they all went under in a tangle of white legs and arms and came up blowing, sputtering, laughing, and gasping for breath at the same time. When they were well exhausted, they would run out and sprawl on the dry hot sand and lie there and cover themselves up with it and break from the water again and go through the original performance once more. Finally, it occurred to them that their naked skin represented flush-colored tights very fairly. So they drew a ring in the sand and had a circus with 3 clowns in it, for none would yield this proudest post to his neighbor. Next, they got their marbles and played knucks and ring tall and keeps till that amusement grew stale. Then Joe and Huck had another swim, but Tom would not venture because he found that in kicking off his trousers, he had kicked his string of rattlesnake rattles off his ankle, and he wondered how he had escaped cramps so long without the protection of this mysterious charm. He did not venture again until he had found it. And by that time, the other boys were tired and ready to rest. They gradually wandered apart and dropped into the dumps and fell to gazing longingly across the wide river to where the village lay drowsing in the sun. Tom found himself writing Becky in the sand with his big toe. He scratched it out and was angry with himself for his weakness, but he wrote it again. Nevertheless, he could not help it. He erased it once more and then took himself out of temptation by driving the other boys together and joining them. But Joe's spirits had gone down almost beyond resurrection. He was so homesick that he could hardly endure the misery of it. The tears lay very near the surface. Huck was melancholy too. Tom was downhearted, but tried hard not to show it. He had a secret, which he was not ready to tell yet. But if this mutinous depression was not broken up soon, he would have to bring it out. He said, with a great show of cheerfulness, "I bet there's been pirates on this island before, boys. We'll explore it again. They've hid treasures here somewhere. How'd you feel to light on a rotten chest full of gold and silver?" Hey, but it roused only a faint enthusiasm, which faded out with no reply. Tom tried 1 or 2 other seductions, but they failed too. It was discouraging work. Joe sat poking up the sand with a stick and looking very gloomy. Finally, he said, "Oh boys, let's give it up. I want to go home. It's so lonesome." "Oh no, Joe, you'll feel better by and by," I said. "Tom, just think of the fishing that's here." "I don't care for fishing. I want to go home." "But Joe, there ain't such another swimming place anywhere. Swimming's no good." "I don't seem to care for it somehow when there ain't anybody to say I shouldn't go in. I mean to go home." "Oh, shucks, baby. You want to see your mother, I reckon." "Yes, I do want to see my mother, and you would too if you had one. I ain't any more baby than you are." And Joe snuffled a little. "Well, we'll let the cry-baby go home to his mother, won't we, Huck, poor thing? Does it want to see its mother, and so it shall. You like it here, don't you, Huck? We'll stay, won't we?" Huck said yes without any heart in it. "I'll never speak to you again as long as I live," said Joe, rising there now. And he moved moodily away and began to dress himself. "Who cares?" said Tom. "Nobody wants you to go long home and get laughed at." "Oh, you're a nice pirate. Hucking me ain't cry-babies. We'll stay. Won't we, Huck? Let him go if he wants to. I reckon we can get along without him perhaps." But Tom was uneasy, nevertheless, and was alarmed to see Joe go sly on with his dressing. And then it was discomforting to see Huck eyeing Joe's preparation so wistfully and keeping up such an ominous silence presently without a parting word. Job began to wade off toward the Illinois shore. Tom's heart began to sink. He glanced at Huck. Huck could not bear the look and dropped his eyes. And then he said, "I want to go too, Tom. It was getting so lonesome anyway, and now it'll be worse. Let's us go too. Tom. I won't. You can all go if you want to. I mean to stay, Tom, I better go. We'll go along. Who's hindering you? Huck began to pick up his scattered clothes and he said, Tom, I wish you'd come to now. You think it over. We'll wait for you when we get to the shore. Well, you'll wait a blame long time. That's all. Huck started sorrowfully away and Tom stood looking after him with a strong desire tugging at his heart to yield his pride and go along too. He hoped the boys would stop, but they still waded slowly on. It suddenly dawned on Tom that it was become very lonely, and still he made one final struggle with his pride and then darted after his comrades yelling, Wait, wait. I want to tell you something. They presently stopped and turned around. When he got to where they were, he began unfolding his secret and they listened moodily till at last they saw the point he was driving at, and then they set up a war whoop of applause and said it was splendid and said, if he had told them at first they wouldn't have started away. He made a plausible excuse. But his real reason had been the fear that not even the secret would keep them with him any very great length of time. And so he had meant to hold it in reserve. As a last seduction, the lads came gaily back and went at their sports again with a will chattering all the time about Tom's stupendous plan and admiring the genius of it. After a dainty egg and fish dinner, Tom said he wanted to learn to smoke. Now, Joe caught at the idea and said he would like to try too. So Huck made pipes and filled them. These novices had never smoked anything before, but cigars made of grapevine, and they bit the tongue and were not considered manly. Anyway, now they stretched themselves out on their elbows and began to puff Charlie, and with slender confidence, the smoke had an unpleasant taste and they gagged a little. But Tom said, why, it's just as easy. If I'd have known this was all, I'd have learned long ago. So would I, said Joe. It's just nothing. Why, many a time I've looked at people smoking and thought, well, I wish I could do that, but I never thought I could, said Tom. That's just the way with me. Hated Huck. You've heard me talk just that way, haven't you, Huck? I'll leave it to Huck if I haven't. Yes, heaps of times, said Huck. Well, I have too, said Tom. Oh, hundreds of times, once down by the slaughterhouse. Don't you remember, Huck? Bob Tanner was there and Johnny Miller and Jeff Thatcher when I said it. Don't you remember, Huck, about me saying that? Yes. That's so, said Huck. That was the day after I lost a white alley. No, was the day before there. I told you so, I said. Tom. Huck recollects it. I believe I could smoke this pipe all day, said Joe. I don't feel sick. Neither do I, said Tom. I could smoke it all day, but I bet you Jeff Thatcher couldn't. Jeff Thatcher? Why, he'd keel over just with 2 draws. Just let him try it once. He'd see. I bet he would. And Johnny Miller? I wish I could see Johnny Miller tackle it once. Oh, don't I said Joe. Why, I bet now Johnny Miller couldn't any more do this than nothing. Just one little sniffer would fetch him. Deed it? Would Joe say, I wish the boys could see us now. So do I, say. Boys, don't say anything about it, and sometime when they're around, I'll come up to you and say, Joe got a pipe. I want to smoke. And you'll say, kind of careless as if it weren't anything. You'll say, yes, I got my old pipe and another one, but my tobacco ain't very good. And I'll say, oh, that's all right if it's strong enough. And then you'll out with the pipes and we'll light up just as calm, and then just see look, by jang. That'll be gay. Tom, I wish it was. Now so do I. And when we tell we learned when we was off pirating, won't they wish they'd been along? Oh, I reckon not. I'll just bet they will. So the talk ran on, but presently it began to flag a trifle and grow disjointed. The silences widened, the expectation marvelously increased, every pore inside the boys' cheeks became a spouting fountain. They could scarcely bail out the cellars under their tongues fast enough to prevent an inundation little overflowing down. Their throats occurred in spite of all they could do. And sudden retching followed every time. Both boys were looking very pale and miserable. Now, Joe's pipe dropped from his nerveless fingers. Tom's followed. Both fountains were going furiously and both pumps bailing with and main. Joe said, feebly, "I've lost my knife. I reckon I better go and find it." Tom said, with quivering lips and halting utterance, "I'll help you. You go over that way and I'll hunt around by the spring." "No, you need and come, Huck, we can find it." So Huck sat down again and waited an hour. Then he found it lonesome and went to find his comrades. They were wide apart in the woods, both very pale, both fast asleep. But something informed him that if they had had any trouble, they'd got rid of it. They were not talkative at supper that night. They had a humble look. And when Huck prepared his pipe after the meal and was going to prepare theirs, they said no. They were not feeling very well. Something they ate at dinner had disagreed with them. About midnight Joe woke and called the boys. There was a brooding oppressiveness in the air that seemed to bode something. The boys huddled themselves together and sought the friendly companionship of the fire. Though the dull dead heat of the breathless atmosphere was stifling, they sat still in intent and waiting. The solemn hush continued beyond the light of the fire. Everything was swallowed up in the blackness of darkness. Presently, there came a quivering glow that vaguely revealed the foliage for a moment and then vanished by, and by another came a little stronger than another. Then a faint moan came sighing through the branches of the forest and the boys felt a fleeting breath upon their cheeks and shuddered with a fancy that the spirit of the night had gone by. There was a pause. Now a weird flash turned night into day and showed every little grass blade separate and distinct and grew about their feet. And it showed 3 white startled faces too. A deep peal of thunder went rolling and tumbling down the heavens and lost itself in surrumblings in the distance. A sweep of chilly air passed by, rustling all the leaves and snowing the flaky ashes broadcast about the fire. Another fierce glare lit up the forest and an instant crash followed that seemed to run the treetops right over the boys' heads. They clung together in terror, in the thick gloom that followed. A few big raindrops fell pattering upon the leaves. "Quick boys, go for the tent," exclaimed Tom. They sprang away, stumbling over the roots and among vines in the dark. No two plunging in the same direction. A furious blast roared through the trees, making everything sing as it went. One blinding flash after another and the peal on peal of deafening thunder, and now a drenching rain poured down in the rising hurricane, drove it in sheets along the ground. The boys cried out to each other, but the roaring wind and the booming thunder blast drowned their voices utterly. However, one by one they straggled in at last and took shelter under the tent, cold, scared and streaming with water. But to have company and misery seemed something to be grateful for. They could not talk. The old sail flapped so furiously, even if the other noises would have allowed them. The tempest rose higher and higher, and presently the sail tore loose from its fastenings and went winging away. On the blast, the boys seized each other's hands and fled with many tumbling and bruises to the shelter of a great oak tree that stood upon the river bank. Now the battle was at its highest under the ceaseless conflagration of lightning that flamed in the skies. Everything below stood out in clean-cut and shadowless distinction: the bending trees, the billowy river white with foam, the driving spray of snow flakes, the dim outlines of the high bluffs on the other side glimpsed through the drifting cloud rack and the slanting veil of rain. Every little while some giant tree yielded the fight and fell crashing through the younger growth. and the unflagging thunder peals came now, and ears-splitting explosive bursts, keen and sharp and unspeakably appalling. The storm culminated in one matchless effort that seemed likely to tear the island to pieces, burn it up, drown it to the treetops and blow it away and deafen every creature in it all at once. At the same moment. It was a wild night for homeless young heads to be out in. But at last the battle was done and the forces retired with weaker and weaker threatenings and grumblings, and peace resumed her sway. The boys went back to camp a good deal awed. But they found there was still something to be thankful for, because the great sycamore, the shelter of their beds, was a ruin now blasted by the lightnings, and they were not under it. When the catastrophe happened, everything in camp was drenched, the campfire as well, for they were but heedless lads like their generation, and had made no provision against rain. Here was matter for dismay, for they were soaked through and chilled. They were eloquent in their distress, but they presently discovered that the fire had eaten so far up under the great log. It had been built against where it curved upward and separated itself from the ground that a handbreadth or so of it had escaped, wetting. So they patiently wrought until, with shreds and bark gathered from undersides of sheltered logs, they coaxed the fire to burn again. Then they piled on great dead boughs till they had a roaring furnace and were glad-hearted once more. They dried their boiled ham and had a feast. And after that, they sat by the fire and expanded and glorified their midnight adventure until morning, for there was not a dry spot to sleep on anywhere around. As the sun began to steal in upon the boys, drowsiness came over them, and they went out on the sandbar and lay down to sleep. They got scorched out by and drily set about getting breakfast after the meal. They felt rusty and stiff-jointed, in a little homesick. Once more, Tom saw the signs and fell to cheering up for the pirates as well as he could. But they cared nothing for marbles or circus or swimming or anything. He reminded them of the imposing secret and raised the rave cheer while it lasted. He got them interested in a new device. This was to knock off being pirates for a while and be Indians for a change. They were attracted by this idea, so it was not long before they were stripped and striped from head to heel with black mud like so many zebras, all of them chiefs of course. And then they went tearing through the woods to attack an English settlement by and by. They separated into 3 hostile tribes and darted upon each other from ambush with dreadful war whoops, and killed and scalped each other by thousands. It was a gory day. Consequently, it was an extremely satisfactory one. They assembled in camp towards supper time, hungry and happy. But now a difficulty arose. Hostile Indians could not break the bread of hospitality together without first making peace. And this was a simple impossibility. Without smoking a pipe of peace, there was no other process that they ever had heard of. 2 of the savages almost wished they had remained pirates. However, there was no other way. So with such show of cheerfulness as they could muster, they called for the pipe and took their whiff as it passed in due form. And behold, they were glad they had gone into savagery, for they had gained something. They found that they could now smoke a little without having to go and hunt for a lost knife. They did not get sick enough to be seriously uncomfortable. They were not likely to fool away this high promise for lack of effort. No, they practiced cautiously after supper with right fair success. And so they spent a jubilant evening. They were prouder and happier in their new acquirement than they would have been in the scalping and skinning of the 6 nations. We will leave them to smoke and chatter and brag, since we have no further use for them at present. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, Pirates at their own funeral. But there was no hilarity in the little town. That same tranquil Saturday afternoon, the Harpers and Aunt Polly's family were being put into mourning with great grief, and many tears and unusual quiet possessed the village. Although it was ordinarily quiet enough in all conscience, the villagers conducted their concerns with an absent mind and talked little, but they sighed often. The Saturday holiday seemed a burden to the children. They had no heart in their sports and gradually gave them up. In the afternoon, Becky Thatcher found herself moping about the deserted schoolhouse yard and feeling very melancholy, but she found nothing there to comfort her. She solidified, "Oh, if I only had a brass and iron knob again, but I haven't gotten anything now to remember him by." And she choked back a little sob presently. She stopped and said to herself, "It was right here. Oh, if it was to do over again, I wouldn't say that and I wouldn't say it for the whole world, but he's gone now. I'll never, never, never see him any more." This thought broke her down and she wandered away with the tears rolling down her cheeks. Then quite a group of boys and girls, playmates of Tom's and Joe's, came by and stood looking over the paling fence and talking in reverent tones of how Tom did so and so the last time they saw him and how Joe said this and that small trifle pregnant with awful prophecy as they could easily see now. And each speaker pointed out the exact spot where the lost lad stood at the time and then added something like, "And I was astounding, just so just as I am now and as if you was him. I was as close as that. And he smiled just this way. And then something seemed to go all over me like awful. And I never thought what it meant of course, but I can see now." Then there was a dispute about who saw the dead boys last in life and many claim that dismal distinction and offered evidence is more or less tampered with by the witness. And when it was ultimately decided who did see the departed last and exchanged the last words with them, the lucky parties took upon themselves as sort of sacred importance and were gaped at and envied by all the rest. One poor chap who had no other grandeur to offer, said with tolerably manifest pride in the remembrance, "Well, Tom Sawyer, he licked me once, but that bid for glory was a failure." Most of the boys could say that. And so that cheapened the distinction too much. The group loitered away, still recalling memories of the lost heroes in awe voices. When the Sunday school hour was finished the next morning, the bell began to toll instead of ringing in the usual way. It was a very still Sabbath. And the mournful sound seemed in keeping with the musing hush that lay upon nature. The villagers began to gather, loitering a moment in the vestibule to converse in whispers about the sad event. But there was no whispering in the house, only the foul rustling of dresses as the women gathered to their seats disturbed the silence there. None could remember when the little church had been so full before. There was finally a waiting pause, an expectant dumbness. And then Aunt Polly entered, followed by Sid and Mary, and they by the Harper family, all in deep black, and the whole congregation. The old minister's well rose reverently and stood until the mourners were seated in the front pew. There was another communing silence broken at intervals by muffled sobs. And then the minister spread his hands abroad and prayed. Moving hymn was sung and the text followed. "I am the resurrection and the life." As the service proceeded, the clergyman drew such pictures of the graces, the winning ways, and the rare promise of the lost lads that every soul there, thinking he recognized these pictures, felt a pang, and remembering that he had persistently blinded himself to them always before and had as persistently seen only faults and flaws in the poor boys. The minister related many a touching incident in the lives of the departed to which illustrated their sweet, generous natures. And the people could easily see now how noble and beautiful those episodes were, and remembered with grief that at the time they occurred, they had seemed rank ras well deserving of the cowhide. The congregation became more and more moved as the pathetic tale went on, till at last the whole company broke down and joined the weeping mourners in a chorus of anguish, sobs, the preacher himself giving way to his feelings and crying in the pulpit. There was a rustle in the gallery, which nobody noticed. A moment later, the church door creaked. The minister raised his streaming eyes above his handkerchief and stood transfixed. First one and another pair of eyes followed the minister's. And then, almost with one impulse, The congregation rose and stared while the three dead boys came marching up the aisle, Tom and the lead Joe next and Huck, a ruin of drooping rags, sneaking sheepishly in the rear. They had been hid in the unused gallery listening to their own funeral sermon. Aunt Polly, Mary and the Harpers threw themselves upon their restored ones, smothered them with kisses and poured out thanksgivings. While poor HK stood abashed and uncomfortable, not knowing exactly what to do or where to hide from so many unwelcoming eyes, he wavered and started to slink away. But Tom seized him and said, "Aunt Polly, it ain't fair. Somebody's got to be glad to see Huck, and so they shall. I'm glad to see him. Poor motherless thing." And the loving attentions, Aunt Polly, lavished upon him were the one thing capable of making him more uncomfortable than he was before. Suddenly, the minister shouted at the top of his voice, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow, sing and put your hearts in it," and they did. Old Hundred swelled up with a triumphant burst, and while it shook the rafters, Tom Sawyer, the pirate, looked around upon the envying juveniles about him and confessed in his heart that this was the proudest moment of his life. As the sold congregation trooped out, they said they would almost be willing to be made ridiculous again. To hear Old Hundred sung like that once more, Tom got more cuffs and kisses that day, according to Aunt Polly's varying moods, than he had earned before in a year. And he hardly knew which expressed the most gratefulness to God and affection for himself. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18, Tom reveals his dream secret. That was Tom's great secret, the scheme to return home with his brother pirates and attend their own funerals. They had paddled over to the Missouri shore in the log at dusk on Saturday, landing 5 or 6 miles below the village. They had slept in the woods at the edge of the town till nearly daylight, and had then crept through back lanes and alleys and finished their sleep in the gallery of the church among a chaos of invalid benches. At breakfast Monday morning, Aunt Polly and Mary were very loving to Tom and very attentive to his wants. There was an unusual amount of talk in the course of it. Aunt Polly said, "Well, I don't say it wasn't a fine joke, Tom, to keep everybody suffering most a week. So you've always had a good time, but it is a pity you could be so hard-hearted as to let me suffer. So if you could have come over on a log to go to your funeral, you could have come over and give me a hint some way that you weren't dead but only run off. Yes, you could have done that." Tom said, "Mary, and I believe you would if you had thought of it, would you?" Tom said. Aunt Polly, her face lightening wistfully, say, "Now, would you if you'd thought of it? Well, I don't know, would have spoiled everything." Tom: "I hoped you loved me that much," said Aunt Polly with a grieved tone that discomforted the boy. "It would have been something if you'd cared enough to think of it, even if you didn't do it." "Now, Auntie, that ain't any harm," pleaded Mary. "It's only Tom's giddy way. He's always in such a rush that he never thinks of anything, more's the pity. Sid would have thought, and Sid would have come and done it too. Tom, you'll look back someday when it's too late and wish you'd cared a little more for me when it would have cost you so little." "Now, Auntie, you know I do care for you," said Tom. "I'd know it better if you acted more like it." "I wish now I'd thought," said Tom with a repentant tone, "but I dreamed about you anyway." "That's something, ain't it?" "It ain't much. A cat does that much, but it's better than nothing." "What did you dream Wednesday night?" "I dreamt that you was sitting over there by the bed and Sid was sitting by the wood box and Mary next to him." "Well, so we did. So we always do. I'm glad your dreams could take even that much trouble about us. And I dreamt that Joe Harper's mother was here. Why, she was here." "Did you dream any more?" "Oh, lots. But it's so dim now." "Well, try to recollect. Can't you somehow? It seems to me that the wind blowed the try harder, Tom." "The wind did blow something, come." Tom pressed his fingers to his forehead an anxious minute and then said, "I've got it now. I've got it now." He blowed the candle. "Mercy on us. Go on, Tom. Go on. And it seems to me that you said why I believe that door. Go on, Tom. Just let me study a moment. Just a moment. Oh yes, you said you believed the door was open as I'm sitting here. I did, didn't I, Mary? Go on. And then, well, I won't be certain, but it seems like as if you made Sid go, and well, what did I make him do, Tom? What did I make him do? You made him shut it. Well, for land's sake, I never heard the beat of that in all my days. Don't tell me there ain't anything in dreams anymore. Serenity Harper shall know of this before I'm an hour older. I'd like to see her get around this with her rubbish about superstition. Go on, Tom. Oh, it's all getting just as bright as day. Now. Next you said I weren't bad. Only mischievous and harem scare him, and not any more responsible than I think it was a cult or something. And so it was. Well, goodness gracious. Go on, Tom. And then you began to cry. So I did. So I did, not the first time neither. And then Mrs. Harper, she began to cry and said Joe was just the same. And she wished she hadn't whipped him for taking cream when she'd throwed it out of her own self. Tom, the Spirit was upon you. You was a prophesying. That's what she was doing. Land alive. Go on, Tom. Well then, Sid, he said, well, I don't think I said anything, said Sid. Yes you did. Sid said, Mary, shut your heads and let Tom go. What did he say, Tom? He said, I think he said he hoped I was better off where I was gone to, but if I'd been better sometimes there. Do you hear that? It was his very words, and you shut him up sharp. I did. There must have been an angel there. There was an angel there somewhere, and Mrs. Harper told about Joe scaring her with a firecracker. And you told about Peter and the painkiller, just as true as I live. And then there was a whole lot of talk about dragging the river for us and about having the funeral Sunday, and then you and old Miss Harper hugged and cried, and she went, it happened. Just so it happened. Just so, as sure as I'm sitting in these very tracks, Tom. You couldn't have told it more like if you'd have seen it. And then what? Go on, Tom. Then I thought you prayed for me, and I could see you and hear every word you said, and you went to bed, and I was so sorry that I took and wrote on a piece of sycamore bark. We ain't dead. We were only off being pirates. And put it on the table by the candle. And then you looked so good laying there asleep that I thought I went and leaned over and kissed you on the lips. Did you, Tom? Did you? I just forgive you everything for that. And she seized the boy in a crushing embrace that made him feel like the guiltiest of villains. It was very kind, even though it was only a dream. Sid soliloquized just audibly. Shut up, Sid. A body does just the same in a dream as he do if he was awake. Here's the big millum apple I been saving for you, Tom. If he was ever found again, now go along to school. I'm thankful to the good God and Father of us all. I've got you back. That's long-suffering and merciful to them that believe on him and keep his word. Though goodness knows I'm unworthy of it, but if only the worthy ones got his blessings and had his hand to help them over the rough places, there's few enough would smile here or ever enter into his rest when the long night comes. Go along. Sid, Mary, Tom, take yourselves off. You've hindered me long enough. The children left for school, and the old lady to call on Mrs. Harper and vanquish her realism with Tom's marvelous dream. Sid had better judgment than to utter the thought that was in his mind as he left the house. It was this: pretty thin, as long as a dream is that, without any mistakes in it, what a hero Tom was become. Now, he did not go skipping and prancing, but moved with a dignified swagger as became a pirate who felt that the public eye was on him. And indeed it was. He tried not to seem to see the looks or hear the remarks as he passed along, but they were food and drink to him. Smaller boys than himself flocked at his heels as proud to be seen with him and tolerated by him as if he had been the drummer at the head of a procession or the elephant leading a menagerie into town. Boys of his own size pretended not to know he had been away at all, but they were consuming with envy. Nevertheless, they would have given anything to have had that swarthy, tan skin of his and his glittering notoriety. And Tom would not have parted with either for a circus at school. The children made so much of him and of Joe and delivered such eloquent admiration from their eyes that the two heroes were not long in becoming insufferably stuck up. They began to tell their adventures to hungry listeners, but they only began. It was not a thing likely to have an end with imaginations like theirs to furnish material. And finally, when they got out their pipes and went serenely puffing around the very summit of glory was reached, Tom decided that he could be independent of Becky Thatcher. Now, glory was sufficient. He would live for glory. Now that he was distinguished, maybe she would be wanting to make up well her. She should see that he could be as indifferent as some other people. Presently, she arrived. Tom pretended not to see her. He moved away and joined a group of boys and girls and began to talk. Soon he observed that she was tripping gaily back and forth with flushed face and dancing eyes, pretending to be busy chasing schoolmates and screaming with laughter when she made a capture, but he noticed that she always made her captures in his vicinity and that she seemed to cast a conscious eye in his direction at such times too. It gratified all the vicious vanity that was in him. And so instead of winning him, it only set him up the more and made him the more diligent to avoid betraying that he knew she was about. Presently, she gave over skylarking and moved resolutely about, sighing once or twice, and glancing furtively and wistfully toward Tom. Then she observed that now Tom was talking more particularly to Amy Lawrence than to anyone else. She felt a sharp pang and grew disturbed and uneasy at once. She tried to go away, but her feet were treacherous and carried her to the group. Instead, she said to a girl almost at Tom's elbow with sham of vivacity, "Why, Mary Austin, you bad girl. Why didn't you come to Sunday school? I did come. Didn't you see me? Why no, where did you sit? I was in Miss Peters' class where I always go. I saw you. Did you? It's funny I didn't see you. I wanted to tell you about the picnic." "Oh, that's jolly. Who's going to give it?" "My ma is going to let me have one." "Oh goody. I hope she'll let me come." "Well, she will. The picnic's for me. She'll let anybody come that I want, and I want you." "That's ever so nice. When is it going to be?" "By and by. Maybe about a vacation." "Oh, won't it be fun? You going to have all the girls and boys?" "Yes. Everyone that's friends to me or wants to be." And she glanced ever so furtively at Tom, but he talked right along to Amy Lawrence about the terrible storm on the island and how the lightning tore the great sycamore tree all to flinders while he was standing within 3 feet of it. "Oh, may I come?" said Gracie Miller. "Yes." "And me," said Sally Rogers. "Yes." "And me too," said Susie Harper and Joe. "Yes." And so on with clapping of joyful hands till all the group had begged for invitations. But Tom and Amy, then Tom turned coolly away, still talking, and took Amy with him. Becky's lips trembled and the tears came to her eyes. She hid these signs with a forced gaiety and went on chattering. But the life had gone out of the picnic now and out of everything else. She got away as soon as she could and hid herself and had what her sex call a good cry. Then she sat moody with wounded pride till the bell rang. She roused up now with a vindictive cast in her eye and gave her plaited tails a shake, and said she knew what she'd do at recess. Tom continued his flirtation with Amy with jubilant self-satisfaction, and he kept drifting about to find Becky and lacerate her with a performance. At last, he spied her, but there was a sudden falling of his mercury. She was sitting cozily on a little bench behind the schoolhouse looking at a picture book with Alfred Temple, and so absorbed were they and their heads so close together over the book that they did not seem to be conscious of anything in the world besides jealousy ran red hot through Tom's veins. He began to hate himself for throwing away the chance. Becky had offered for a reconciliation. He called himself a fool and all the hard names he could think of. He wanted to cry with Asian. Amy chatted happily along as they walked. For her heart was singing, but Tom's tongue had lost its function. He did not hear what Amy was saying, and whenever she paused expectantly, he could only stammer an awkward assent, which was as often misplaced as otherwise. He kept drifting to the rear of the schoolhouse again and again to sear his eyeballs with a hateful spectacle there. He could not help it, and it maddened him to see as he thought. He saw that Becky Thatcher never once suspected that he was even in the land of the living, but she did see nevertheless, and she knew she was winning her fight too and was glad to see him suffer as she had suffered. Amy's happy, prat became intolerable. Tom hinted at things. He had to attend to things that must be done, and time was fleeting, but in vain. The girl chirped on. Tom thought, "Oh, hang her. Ain't I ever going to get rid of her at last?" He must be attending to those things, and she said, artlessly, that she would be around when school left out, and he hastened away hating her for it. Any other boy, Tom thought, gritting his teeth, any boy in the whole town, but that St. Louis smarter that thinks he dresses so fine and is aristocracy. "Oh, all right. I licked you the first day you ever saw this town, mister, and I'll lick you again. You just wait till I catch you out. I'll just take," and he went through the motions of thrashing. An imaginary boy pummeling the air and kicking and gouging. "Oh, you do you? You holler enough, do you now? Then let that learn you." And so the imaginary flogging was finished to his satisfaction. Tom fled home at noon. His conscience could not endure any more of Amy's grateful happiness, and his jealousy could bear no more of the other distress. Becky resumed her picture inspections with Alfred, but as the minutes dragged along and no Tom came to suffer, her triumph began to cloud and she lost interest. Gravity and absent-mindedness followed, and then melancholy. 2 or 3 times she pricked up her ear at a footstep, but it was a false hope. No, Tom came at last. She grew entirely miserable and wished she hadn't carried it so far. When poor Alfred, seeing that he was losing her, he did not know how, kept exclaiming, "Oh, here's a jolly one. Look at this." She lost patience at last and said, "Oh, don't bother me. I don't care for them," and burst into tears and got up and walked away. Alfred dropped alongside and was going to try to comfort her, but she said, "Go away and leave me alone. Can't you? I hate you." So the boy halted, wondering what he could have done, for she had said she would look at pictures all through the noon, and she walked on crying. Then Alfred went musing into the deserted schoolhouse. He was humiliated and angry. He easily guessed his way to the truth. The girl had simply made a convenience of him to vent her spite upon Tom Sawyer. He was far from hating Tom the less when this thought occurred to him. He wished there was some way to get that boy into trouble without much risk to himself. Tom's spelling book fell under his eye. Here was his opportunity. He gratefully opened to the lesson for the afternoon and poured ink upon the page. Becky, glancing in at a window behind him at the moment, saw the act and moved on without discovering herself. She started homeward now, intending to find Tom and tell him Tom would be thankful and their troubles would be healed before she was halfway home. However, she had changed her mind. The thought of Tom's treatment of her when she was talking about her picnic came scorching back and filled her with shame. She resolved to let him get whipped on the damaged spelling books account and to hate him forever into the bargain. End of chapter 18. Please like, share, comments and subscribe my channel. Thanks.